Welcome to the Power of Food podcast. We are so excited to bring you evidence-based nutrition information focusing on addressing the root cause for imbalance. Food has the power to help you achieve lifelong optimal health without the side effects of prescription medication. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast platform. I am Stacy Seslowski, functional nutrition registered dietitian.
And I am Leah Grace Barrick, functional nutritionist.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Power of Food podcast. We have a very special guest today, Hilarie Dreyer. Hilarie is a registered dietitian currently working in a pediatric neurodevelopment clinic at a children's hospital in Michigan. Hilarie recently started a private practice called Blended Tube Feeding to help parents of tube-fed children who want support and education on how to provide a real food blended diet to their child rather than only commercial enteral products. She is passionate about food and how it impacts us in so many aspects of life, and it has been a fun journey incorporating this passion with her dietitian experience to help those parents who want to provide real whole food to their tube-fed children and watch what a difference it makes for the child and the whole family. Welcome to the Power of Food podcast, Hilarie. We're so excited to have you on and talk about this topic that we haven't even touched the surface of on this podcast before. So welcome.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here. I've been thinking about this for a while. I'm excited to talk to you guys.
Amazing. Well, let's just start off. I'd love for you to share a little bit about your background, your dietetic experience, and what really led you to starting blended tube feeding.
Sure. So I'm trying to keep this brief. I feel like I could go on for a while, but my education and training was pretty clinical focused. So a lot of like ICU, TPN, tube feeds. I really enjoyed pediatrics, and I think I was pretty lucky to get an internship that had a pediatric focus. We were actually in a children's hospital for a part of it, so I got a lot of pediatric experience there. And so the goal when I came home was to work in a children's hospital. And so I did my internship in California, and I live in Michigan now. And so I was hoping to come home and like get right into a children's hospital, but that wasn't the case. There was like no openings in either children's hospital that I am close to. So I worked first in a maternal infant health program, which was primarily home visiting. And I did that for about 2 years. There was some like WIC with that as well. But I'm honestly pretty thankful for that experience because like it totally shaped the dietitian that I am today. I think when you like get to actually go to the home, you develop a deeper connection with the family, and they're actually like honest with you about what they're doing. Where like, you know, they would tell me, oh, this providers are telling me these recommendations and I haven't been able to follow through for whatever reason. And a lot of times it's like, for good reason. And so you develop like so much empathy for these families and like what they're going through. And I think that just really like shaped the way that I like approach nutrition. And so I would just like, I kind of told myself, I'm like, I'm not going to be one of those providers that's just like, I'm going to tell you what to do and then that's it. And like, just you're on your way. And so I eventually got into the children's hospital and just continued to practice that way, like taking in parent perspective and making sure like they're on board with the plan rather than me just telling them like what I think they should do. Cause like really like, what's the point of doing that? You know, like you can make like the best recommendation in the world. And if they're not going to be able to follow through with it, like you really didn't do anything. And so that really shaped, you know, how I was as a dietitian. And so then in the last 3 years, I've been working in the neurodevelopment clinic. I think I'm lucky to be in a clinic that also approaches medical care that way. Like all the providers are very like patient center based and really listening to the parents. Like they get a whole hour with the doctor, which is a long time compared to a lot of clinics. And so I think we really hear the families out, and that's been really, really cool. And so that's kind of how I got into blended tube feeding, because the clinic that I'm in is actually a big supporter of blended tube feeding, which is not normal, I think, for a lot of places. But we're kind of a clinic that like thinks outside the box, and we don't always go by the book. I mean, we're safe, but we don't always go by the book, and we do what the parents want. And through this, I've seen like some pretty cool stuff. Like you get off tube feeds faster, and like kids are, they're just like parents like, my kid is so much happier. And like, we just listen to what the parent thinks is going to work, and we just try it, and it's like made a huge difference. And that's been pretty cool. So that's kind of how I got into blended tube feeding, is because we do that. When I started in the clinic 3 years ago, the dietitian was really supportive. And so I just took over her whole patient panel, which was a lot of blended tube feeding, and just kind of had to dive in and make it work. And then being in the community the last 3 years, like I've just really seen, like on the Facebook groups and other places, like families feel super unsupported by their doctors or their dietitians. And I just see such a need for this on a larger scale, and felt like I could only make so much impact in the clinic I'm in. And so, yeah, so I started blended tube feeding, and then trying to be a resource to all these families that really want this cool way to feed their kid.
I have to say, excuse me, thank you, Hilarie, for creating this type of service, because I think you're right. There is such a big need. I do think that families go home, with their children on home tube feedings, and they don't get the support and the instructions that they need. Before, I want to hear more about exactly what is blended tube feedings, but I was also wondering if you can kind of just give us a picture of what it is like to feed a tube feeding at home. Like, what are parents being expected to do, and what does it feel like to them?
Yeah, so it can totally change depending on the patient. Like, some kids do super well and can tolerate quite a large volume in a small amount of time. And there's kids that are pretty, they have a lot of feeding problems. And so you could have a child that needs to be fed with a very slow drip. And so that would mean I can kind of take a step back. So there's like a gastrostomy tube that's in your stomach. And that's one way to feed your child, but you then need to use like extension tubing and all of this equipment to basically provide this formula or liquid through the tube to meet your child's nutrition needs. And that could be, like I was saying, like the continuous drip, where you're connected to a pump around the clock and you're given a really slow amount of nutrition at a time. Otherwise, some of these kids just puke all the time or have other issues. Or, a family could use a 2-ounce syringe, and you're just filling that syringe and you're pushing food through as fast as they can tolerate. And so, I think even for the ones that don't have a lot of feeding issues, it's still an extra step compared to just giving the child what you feed the rest of the family. You have to clean so many supplies. That's the headaches I hear from families, is like, it's so messy and there's so many supplies, and you have to have like a whole room full of supplies that you get from your medical supply company, because there's just so much that they send you, and the boxes and boxes of formula. And so I think it's a lot. When a kid feeds 5-6 times a day, it can feel like you're just doing this 24/7.
That's a lot. Yeah, I can't even imagine. So thank you for explaining that, because I think for like the general population, they have no idea like what goes into that. And I'd love to hear, like, what are most of the children dealing with that they have to have these tube feedings? Like, is it most of the same demographic that you're seeing? Is it different things that the children are dealing with? So I'd love for you to just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So my clinic is a neurodevelopment clinic. So we primarily follow NICU babies. And so, there's many different clinics, like a nephrology clinic that's like kidney doctors, or a pulmonology clinic with lung doctors, or a GI clinic with, your stomach doctors. And so, like, it can kind of depend. So I'll touch just on my clinic first, but we, like I said, primarily follow NICU babies. And so these babies are just not ready to eat by mouth. That could be because they were born so early, they just didn't develop the oral motor skills to do that. And they're working with feeding therapists. So they might get some of their nutrition by mouth, but they just can't sustain based on, like, they just don't have the skills to do it yet. And so they need to have some through the tube. Some of them have pretty bad brain injuries that might not ever learn how to eat by mouth. And so they'll always be fed by tube. And then we have other kids with swallowing difficulties and dysphagia. And so they're just not able to safely swallow. They aspirate and get food into their lungs. And so then we have to bypass that and feed them through a tube that way. And then I could touch on other clinics, like a kid who has chronic lung disease. It's just not safe for them to eat from a breathing standpoint. Like, breathing takes priority over eating. So we bypass that and we feed them through a tube that way. And then we have kids with severe food allergies that might not be able to eat all the food that they need to grow well. And so we have to give a specialized formula to meet needs. And that's probably just touching on a few of the things. There's so many other ways, but primarily in my clinic, it's preemie babies that just are not ready to eat. And then those who had such severe brain injuries that we continue to follow because they'll never be able to eat by mouth enough or at all to sustain growth.
So what are the various options for nutritional products, formulas? You seem to do some type of blending of either formulas or homemade ingredients. But so yeah, can you give us some information about all of those choices?
Yeah. So right now, I would say majority of patients are fed with a formula. And so this would be by a company that creates either like a most of them are nutritionally complete, which is kind of a funny term, but basically that means like all of their nutrition needs can be met through that one formula. And so that's primarily how kids are fed. With the uptick of people wanting to give more real food, some of these companies are coming up with their own blend products. So that might be like they're using, like some products have like a phytonutrient blend in the product. Others would have like powdered real food mixed in with some synthetic ingredients. And then there's some that are now like blending, like actual blended, like salmon, oat, and quinoa could be in a pouch. And that would be an example of like a baby, like it's almost like a baby food puree. They're thicker. They're not like your typical, like I would compare to like, probably people know of Ensure or Pediatric. That would be something that could be fed by two, would be considered nutritionally complete to meet all their nutrition needs based on like, DRI. We could go further into that, but, and then there's the products that are more like baby food purees where they're physically blended food into a pouch that are like shelf stable and you can feed that through a tube. And then I guess then further than that would be the blended tube feeding, where it's the family is physically blending food into a thin enough consistency with liquid that it could be given through a tube. And that could be a mixture of things. I think people think it's an all or nothing thing where you have to do all real food or you have to do formula, but I see a little bit of everything where you might use formula as the base and just blend some real food into that formula. Some families will use just baby food purees and blend that together. There's some cool products out there now that are powdered that you can add liquid to, and that can be another way. Like it's like a real food dehydrated product that you can add liquid to. So there's a lot more stuff out there and a lot of options for families.
Really cool. Yeah. So it sounds like there's many different ways to provide a blended tube feeding diet versus, just like doing this one product and going to it. I would imagine it has a lot to do with the family and like how capable they feel. So it's great that you're providing the support because I'm sure, getting it from Whole Foods, a lot of parents are wanting to kind of do that rather than just give all of the prepackaged products. Do you find that a lot of parents are really curious about kind of making the formulas themselves or supplementing with that?
Yeah, I've definitely seen a lot more interest over the last couple of years. It's hard to say because I've been in a clinic that promotes it. I might be like a special population, but I think just seeing things online and just the push of the formula companies who typically just had products that were all synthetic ingredients that are now making real food-based products. So we definitely get a lot of interest from families. I've actually found too, like some families, you can tell they want to talk about it and then they don't. And I wonder if they've gotten pushback from other medical providers and they're afraid to ask if it's okay, which is kind of another topic in itself. But yeah, I definitely find more and more families are interested or they're interested in the real food products, like the commercial blends. And I think that's due to like social media and just it being way more accessible and way more known because of the internet.
So how would a family know what to give what to put in that blend, and how would they know, are there certain nutritional guidelines that a family should follow to make sure that they're giving complete nutrition if they choose to do this versus the prepackaged products?
Yeah, so I think this is part of the, like a lot of the blend community is feeling pushback because they feed their child like a child that eats by mouth food fine. And so then it's like you put it through a tube and it's like all of a sudden it's panic, and it doesn't necessarily have to be. And I think that's part of the problem with the medical community is you can be so calculated with tube feeds, and so you just become calculated, and because you're prescribing their nutrition, you want to make sure it's complete. You want to make sure you're meeting all their needs. And so then you do that. And an easy way to do that is with formula. And so I think that's kind of going back to your question. Like, I don't think we have to be nutritionally complete every day when we do real food. And I think it doesn't have to be as hard as we make it. But it can be hard when you have a kid with a lot of feeding problems and medical complexities, because they might have very specific nutrition needs, and you do need to blend it down into a very thin consistency that's not going to clog a tube. And so there's a lot of ways that you can go about it. And I think it just depends on the patient and the family and what they have capacity for. And so I have some families that will really just blend the food that they're giving the rest of the family. They might change a few ingredients depending on if they have a good blender or not. You might change a few things, or maybe their kid needs a lot of calories or protein, and so they'll throw some extra stuff into the blend that way. I have some families that we need to be a little bit more calculated and controlled at first or at some point, especially if they're pretty, intolerant to a lot of volume. So then we come up with we call it a recipe, where it's like a list of food and liquid and kind of exact quantities, and they blend that all up. And then that would be like a 24-hour volume, and you just split it into feeds for the day. And so that's another way to do it. If you need to be a little bit more calculated, and I'll have some families too that are just kind of like winging it, where they just feed what they feed the rest of the family, and they'll put their some ideas of what they are feeding into this app called Chronometer. It's a good nutrition software. I'm sure you guys know about that one, but I love that one. And it's a good one for families to be able to break down the vitamins and minerals themselves. I don't want people to get too calculated about it, so I don't love to have people always on there, but I think it's a good way to just see, like, are you always missing out on one vitamin, and like, how can you add that food in to make sure that it's complete? And then really you just watch growth. You watch growth, you watch development, and as long as they're growing well, they look good, they're happy, they're healthy, you can kind of assume that needs are being met, just like you would with an oral eater that you can't be as calculated with.
I love that approach to it, because as you were saying, like, I feel like it would be so easy to get really stressed out about making sure you have like the perfect amount of X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. But then when you look at like your average kid who's like refusing to eat anything but French fries or something like that, it's like, okay, well, we're much better off than that. So that's a really nice approach. And like you said, like, just make sure they're growing well and not stress too much about it. So awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits of blended tube feeding, both for the health of the child, but also if there's any benefits beyond that?
Yeah. So I've worked with like thousands of kids that are tube fed over the last 7 years, and a lot of time in the children's hospital. And a lot of them struggle with things like reflux or vomiting and constipation and discomfort. And when you switch them to receiving like any amount of real food, it makes a huge difference. And that can be like a commercial blend product, or blending just a little bit of food into their formula. We're getting them off medications, especially bowel movement medications, like reflux medications, or like motility agents. Like, a lot of our kids end up getting off those medications, which is like super cool. Way less like hospital admissions and illnesses. Like, so many families will be like, my kid that's blended tube fed, like, they don't ever get sick. My kid, all my other kids have colds all the time. Like, my kid never gets sick. And I really think that's a testament to the power of real food, So that's huge. And I think that kind of touches on too, like, there's so many times where I've seen a kid come to our clinic and they've seen so many specialists for constipation or all their feeding issues, and we never touched on what we were feeding the kid. And I just think, I'm like, that should be the first thing we look at, like, why are we band-aiding it with so many medications if we've just been feeding them the wrong thing? And I'm lucky to be in a clinic that does approach with real food first. And we just look and see, like, what have we been feeding them? Let's address that first. And then let's try medication if we've exhausted all those options. And I think, unfortunately, it's too common that we just go right to medication and we don't necessarily go with the real food. But like benefits beyond that, I think is for the parents. I think honestly, that's been the coolest part of blended tube feeding. These families of kids who have so many medical complexities, they don't really get to be involved. I mean, they're involved, but they don't get to make the decisions about their child's care, especially like all the medical care. And so like when so much is out of your control and you just see them suffering and you can't do anything about it, I think that's really hard for a parent. And when you get to go to the grocery store and actually prepare a home cooked meal for your kid and see that they start to feel better and you get them off medications and they're less there's less hospitalizations and they're not getting as sick and you're the one that's the reason for that. I think that's like the coolest thing. And parents are just like so empowered by that.
That's amazing. I mean, the emotional aspect of this, could really change the whole trajectory of not only the child's health, but even the family, as a whole. So I think you're doing an amazing thing. I'm sure you do experience a lot of pushback. You mentioned it a couple of times from the medical community, from families that are just skeptical. How do you address that kind of concern?
Yeah. So when it comes to us directly, it's pretty easy because we're right on board with blended tube feeding. But I do find people are reaching out and saying like, my doctor isn't on board. Like, what do I say? And so I try to give them some resources to share with their doctors about how to approach this and why, like all the benefits of this and just some things, like even some like research articles and that sort of thing. I know that usually works better for providers if you have like sound evidence-based research and why this is working well. And there's a lot more out there. And so I try to approach it that way. And I think when you get pushback, well, like, I think it's kind of interesting because I'll have families that come to me and they're not, they say everything is going well, like they're on a standard formula and everything's like going super well. And you're like, in your head, you're like, I know that real food might go better, but it's pretty common for a parent to accept a suboptimal state of health, I would say, for their child who's pretty medically complex. And at the same time, you don't want to make them feel bad for giving formula because it's, fed is best. And I think formula works well for some families, but so I actually have gotten pushback on both sides where I've mentioned like, you could try some real food, or like, if you heard about these products, like a lot of my families are doing so well on them and you almost offend them for using formula when you don't want to do that either. So it's a pretty fine line of like, you don't want to push too hard and you kind of get pushback from both ways. It's been kind of interesting to navigate, but I always just want to present my families with all the options out there, and ultimately it's their choice and whatever is working well for them is okay.
Totally. Yeah. And do you find that the main reason that more people aren't doing blended tube feedings is because of the medical professionals not always being on board, or are there other reasons that more people aren't doing them?
I think it's probably both. I think for the ones that really want to do it, it's probably because they don't feel supported, and it can feel pretty intimidating to do on your own. And I've actually heard too, like a family will really, really like their doctor and not really want to find a new clinic, or, I mean, there's only how many children's hospitals are there in your area, like you're kind of stuck with the providers that you have. And so you just, oh geez, I'm dog sitting and the dog is loud. Hopefully she stops soon. But anyway, what was I saying?
You were saying like they like their doctors, so they might not want to switch doctors just because.
Yep. So there's that. And then I think also for a family, then if you don't have that support, it's pretty intimidating to get started. There's just some more nuances that go into it and some equipment stuff. And if you're already so busy, it can feel like a lot to have to then take on this task, even if it's or want to try it, if it's best and you want to try it. I think cost can be a factor if you're getting all of your formula covered and now you're having to buy extra food. That can be a lot. And it can be a lot when you're like scraping by in general. And so I think that's a lot of the concern too, is like the extra cost that's going to go into finding these foods. And of course, like you have to have all this stuff on hand. So it's just a lot to pay for, or it can be if you're already getting formula covered. then I think too, just people just don't know about it. Like even medical professionals, like I didn't even know this was a thing until like 3 years ago, like it wasn't even on my radar, which is seems so crazy to me to not even know about it or even think it's like as someone that works with tube feeding all the time, but thinking back to like your internship, like, or your textbooks, like it was not something I remember learning about at all. So if we don't know about it, I mean, these families don't either.
Yeah. In the very beginning of enteral feedings, I mean, even dietitians in the hospital made formula. They literally put sugar together with oil together with, I don't know what for source of protein that they used to create formulas. So I know my teachers, when I was in my dietetic internship, would say, well, I remember when we used to make formula. So it was a thing. And then these companies came out with these, synthetic products. But I think what you're saying makes so much sense that, first of all, it doesn't have to be all the time. They could use some formula and some foods, and just kind of mix it up to make it a little easier for themselves. But then the other piece to this is really the most important fact is that they're giving by using their own foods. I mean, they're giving whole unprocessed foods and ingredients, which is what we, promote and recommend for all people. So why not, consider that for some of our most vulnerable people,
Yep.
Yeah. So avoiding those processed ingredients can be just so helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a preference with regards to the formulas? Do you recommend one brand versus another?
I definitely have preferences based on like anecdotal experience with my patients, of ones that generally they do better on, but I don't have any that I won't recommend. And I know that's probably a touchy subject for some that think that certain formulas are terrible and not good to use, but I do think Fed is best. And you can make any formula work. And I think some could be better than others, but I would say when a family is not ready to do a blend or doesn't have the capacity to do that, I push more for the real food-based formulas. And that could be something like the complete organic blend or the real food blends or Nourish. And every kid reacts differently. And so one might do well on one and one might not do well on the other. And sometimes those thicker formulas don't work well. Like they're higher calorie and you have to dilute them with water and the pump malfunctions. And I know families just hate that no pump or no flow is like just a nightmare to them. It goes off all the time. And so something like a thicker formula might not work well for them or might not be tolerated. And so I like to use Kate Farms for that reason, or the Complete Pediatric. Those are a little bit thinner. And I really actually, touching back on Kate Farms, I really like Kate Farms for the reason that it's meant by mouth or by tube. I think that's huge too, because so many of our kids aren't solely fed their formula by tube. And so to get off the tube, they get their G tube out quicker, we need to provide a pretty high calorie beverage. It's hard to meet their needs solely on food right away. And so we work on what we call PO gavage, where you give your food by mouth first, and then you give it the remainder through the tube. And so Kate Farms is awesome for that because it's meant to taste good. And these kids do so much better on this one than they do on some other standard products. So quite often I'm finding myself changing kids to Kate Farms because they've been constipated and reflux and just super uncomfortable on their standard other formula. And I switch them to Kate Farms, and it's like parents like, oh my gosh, my kid's a different kid. Like they're so happy. They're pooping all the time. They have so much more energy. So I'll use Kate Farms for that reason. But if they are completely tube fed and not by mouth, then I do find that going even further to the real food blends or the Nourish or Complete Organic blend takes them one step further to feeling better.
Very interesting. Yeah, that makes so much sense that if you're transitioning, having the one that tastes good and have the kids start having that would help a lot. I'd imagine with so many parents going through this, there is some kind of community aspect to blend feeding. And I'd love for you to just touch on that. And if within that community, there's any kind of guard up against dietitians or medical professionals, or how that all works.
Yeah. So there's a lot of communities out there, and some are okay with medical professionals being in them and some aren't. And so there's a few that I'm not allowed in as a medical professional. I have families that I work with that are in them that have said it's a great community. They learn so much from those families, but there's a lot of pushback about medical professionals, and a lot of like, don't work with them. They don't want to support us. And even a lot of shaming for using formula, and a lot of like internet fear mongering, I would say, which is kind of unfortunate. But I also do think that no matter what, those communities are important. And if you can weed through some of the other stuff, it's okay. I hate for a parent to feel shame for any way that they're feeding their child. But the ones that I am in, it's the internet, like you're going to have that no matter what. But the ones I am in, I think are pretty supportive communities, and it's pretty cool. I mean, I learned like probably more from there than I have in anything else, because these are the people that are doing this every day, and they have so many different problems they're working through. I mean, I blend to practice different recipes, but I'm not blending every day and storing a million ounces of food in my freezer and trying to navigate that. And so I learned so much from families there, and it's been, when I'm commenting or providing some resources, it's been well received, and people are happy to see that there's more medical professionals getting on board.
So where do you see the future of this going?
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I mean, I think in the last 3 years, it's been a big shift. Like, maybe whether that's because we're getting on more commercial blended products. Before, it was really like impossible to get those covered by insurance, and it's a lot easier over the last 3 years. And so we're changing more kids over because it's covered, and then we're seeing what a difference it makes. And then that, I think, fuels the thought of, well, what if I blend food myself? Like, what would happen with that? And so I think there's a big shift because of that. And then I have noticed more medical professionals, at least in my area, getting on board. When I first started in the neurodevelopment clinic, I think we were the only specialty clinic willing or had the capacity to help families. And that is not the case anymore. More professionals or more of the dietitians in other clinics have been able to start these and are more curious and asking me more questions. So I think, and even too, when I see on the Facebook groups, like, oh, my dietitian's getting on board. And so I think it's been a huge shift. And I think we'll see that continuing to shift, especially as we see what a difference it's been making on these kids, and like all the medications and or like the less medications, and how much better they're feeling. And I think doctors are starting to see that too.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Hilarie. It's been so wonderful having you on. I know I've learned a ton, and I'm so happy that, you are out there in the world helping families through this really tough thing and providing a lot of empathy and support. So thank you so much. Do you want to tell our listeners where they can find you, follow you, get in touch with you?
Yeah. So thanks for having me. It's been like fun to talk about this. I know it's an interesting topic that not a lot of people know about, so I'm always happy to share. But I am on Instagram. It's at Blended Tube Feeding. And then otherwise, I have a website, not a blog yet, but I am starting to put some stuff up there because I think it's helpful to have those resources. And it's blendedtubefeeding.com. And through that too, I have a newsletter you can sign up for where I share just different things like cool podcasts I found for like the rare condition community, and tips and tricks about just tube feeding in general. So even if you aren't doing blended tube feeding, I have just like tube feeding tips and tricks and resources on there too.
Thank you so much. As Leah said, you're just offering such a unique service that I think that you're going to get a lot of interest from people who need help from you. So my name is Stacy Seslowski. My company is called Heal From Food, and you could find me at healfromfood.com. And
I'm Leah Grace Barrick. You can find me at gracefunctionalnutrition.com. I'm also on Instagram at gracefunctionalnutrition, and feel free to shoot me an email at leah@gracefunctionalnutrition.com.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.